Good afternoon and welcome to the 8th installment of our Leading Through People webinar series. Today we're focusing on remote work and what it means for employers, workers and Ireland Inc. In terms of opportunity and challenge. We'd love you all to get involved, so please comment in the chat bar on the right hand side of your screen. We also have a poll which we'd love you to vote on, and the poll this week is what percentage of the workforce will work remotely post-COVID. So I have two people on today that may change your mind on that as we go through the next 45 minutes to an hour. First guest is Brendan McGinty, Managing Partner at Stratis Consulting, Strategic HR Advisor, Chair of Skillnet and a previous Director of IBEC. He's many years experience advising some of Ireland's largest organisations on HR strategy and industrial relations policy. I've known Brendan for a couple of years. Welcome, Brendan.
Good morning.
How are you? I'm also joined by Kevin Green, regular guest, ex-HR Director of the Royal Mail, Strategic HR Advisor, author of Competitive People Strategy, #1 best-selling book ever in HR ever. I'm going to send you an invoice for that one. And he's been advisor to FRS for a number of years. And just in other news this week, Kevin, I was just saying to someone earlier, it's a great day when Ireland beat England in football or rugby, right? But when we beat England at cricket, it's just really, really fantastic. Beating you at your national game, it's just fantastic. How do you like? And you know, I was such ignominy that an Irishman captains the English cricket team. Must be a terrible thing to swallow. But then when we go and beat you, it's like just, you know.
Well, I think we'll be opening up the Tower of London and getting those guys in there. And I don't quite know what happened. I mean, I think we've got to put it in perspective. We did win the series. It was, you know, it was the game at the end of the series. So we have to sort of rationalise this by saying perhaps they weren't at their best. They weren't focused.
More English excuses, yeah, very good. Well, look, thanks a million, both of you, for coming on today. Really, I suppose we'll move into the piece on remote working in a couple of minutes. But first, I suppose, where are we seeing where are we in the economic cycle really around COVID-19, and what are we seeing really on the ground? Brendan, what are you seeing from your clients across Ireland in terms of where they're at in terms of hiring and sort of staffing and that piece?
Yeah, look, I mean, it's obviously been a hugely turbulent number of months since all of this kicked off. And I mean, just to give you a sense of it, I mean, the unemployment rate peaked at about 28% back in April from about, remember, we were about 4.8% in February. So, you know, that gives you a sort of a sense, I suppose, of scale. But I think what's interesting to see at the moment is as all sectors are grappling with returning to work, as we call it, or probably, well, look, obviously people have still been working in a remote context insofar as they've been obviously retained by their employer. But the top three sectors in which employees have actually been returning to work from the most recent stats that are available to us are obviously accommodation and food services, wholesale and retail trade, repair of motor vehicles, and obviously construction. So it's just interesting to see that. Now, obviously, there are key sectors that have been, let's call it, categorized as essential. So everything from pharma to medtech, etc., including financial services and so on. People have continued to function, albeit by observing all the public health guidelines and so on. So we're starting to see positive, albeit tentative, moves to try and get back to some level of the new normal, as we're calling it. But, and I think this is the real challenge that we're all having to face up to, is that despite all of that, we're still looking at incredibly hard yards in the unemployment sphere. And while unemployment will decline, obviously, as the economy reopens, it's interesting to see that the ESRI here, the Economic and Social Research Institute here in Ireland, they actually haven't called an absolute number on that. They've actually produced a number of baseline scenarios, and the best case scenario is I suppose, an unemployment rate of 15.2%, and the most severe at 19.4%. So that's still, no matter what way you cut that, those are serious numbers and serious pain for lots of people.
And just, I suppose, I was reading some stuff from the OECD this morning around, I suppose, automation, future of work stuff, right? And what their analysis is really where people are in, I suppose, jobs that typically aren't automated, right, or are less risk of automation, move from job to job and sector pretty easily, right? And those that are in roles that are you know, relatively, are a lot higher in potential of being automated, tend to stay within those sectors or move to other sectors that are also automated. So I know the government, and you're involved obviously from your from a Skillnet perspective in this, and but it is a huge challenge, isn't it, to move people from those sort of, like if we look at retail and hospitality, from those sectors into other sectors that are less at risk of either automation or less, you know, higher value jobs for those sort of people, isn't it? So it's
absolutely. But I think the one thing that this crisis has shown, and you know, has everybody now should have tattooed on their forehead, is, look, how do we reskill? Because the reality is, given what is now facing us in terms of both the challenge of, you know, the physical work organization, but also the impact on business models, and what sectors will grow, what sectors will continue to recede. Within all of that, all the data is showing that there are still a whole variety of key skills, of which, to my mind, 80% of companies are simply still going to have to get to grips with. And that's everything from, you know, customer service, digitalization. The STEM skills are still going to be in big demand out there, supply chain knowledge, all of those issues, as well as, of course, the softer skills. But we're also, I mean, you know, what's incredible to see is also, as a result of COVID, all of a sudden, other new role requirements are all of a sudden have been projected forward. So, you know, even managing the safe to return to work protocols, you're seeing anybody in the health and safety sphere all of a sudden, obviously, in very high demand. But you know, issues about, you know, data management, data science, data cleansing, all of that is now very firmly, you know, further ahead in terms of being in big demand, because of having to manage huge volumes of data now in the most disjointed of work organization scenarios.
And we see that this morning with the announcement from TikTok coming to Ireland to set up their data security centre here, Kevin, by the way. Another win over England. But anyway, Kevin, what are you seeing in the UK and wider sort of economies across Europe and the world?
You know, I mean, I think it's an interesting time. I mean, I think what we have to accept is there's a period of dislocation and disruption to business, which is unprecedented. All the economic data here and certainly across Europe shows that, you know, this is a much faster and deeper recession than we've had previously, even in comparison to 2008, 2009, which had been a significant downturn. So in the UK, I mean, GDP dropped by 30%, over 30% in the second quarter. We've got unemployment of 2 million. And predicted to go up to about 3.5 million by the end of the year. So, you know, from under 4% to over 10% in a very short space of time. And if you look at that in comparison to what happened in 2008, 2009, we never got to 10%. You know, we never got anywhere near it. It got to about 8 and a bit percent. And it took us nearly 2 years to get there. So this is happening in 6 months. And it's twice as bad. So we've really had a period of disruption and dislocation for organizations. And they're struggling, there are a range of sectors. Some businesses are still doing okay, revenue's good, they're defending their EBITDA. Others are having to reinvent their whole business model. And so, again, you have to look at this with a sectorial focus. Some industries have been hugely decimated and others are doing quite well. So, again, that's clear. The ending of furlough in the UK is going to have a significant impact on the jobs market. 9 million people at the moment are furloughed, 2 million self-employed people supported, 2 million unemployed. That means you've got over a third of the workforce are not working.
So in Ireland, Kevin, the government tapered what we call the wage subsidy scheme effectively. So it's carrying on into next year. Are the UK government just going with a cliff edge type of scenario, or?
Yeah, it is tapered. It's tapered across August, September and October, but then it ends. There's then an incentive in January for people that are still retained of £1,000. But in reality, there is a cliff edge, which will accelerate unemployment. And the reason why they don't think it should go any further is because what they don't want to do is be supporting jobs that are long-term unsustainable. And to go to Brendan's point, and I think that our government hasn't got this right, and I hope the Irish are certainly leading on this, which is you have to put in place the reskilling and the retraining activity. And that's where the funding from government needs to go. Because not only have we got this dislocation and crisis, but we've also got what you started to talk about was the whole AI, machine learning, the automation of activity, which was coming anyhow. And what this crisis has done is accelerated that. So it's happening much faster. So, for example, I'm a director of an organization. It's a technology business in financial services. It traditionally had lots of call center activity. They moved to an automated chatbot. We've now extended the opening hours from 7 in the morning till 10 in the evening, Saturdays and Sundays. We're doing it with less staff, but we need more skill in terms of some data scientists and more people. So actually we're employing some more people in some areas as we downsize in some of the front end activity. So that business is having to retrain quite significantly through adopting AI and machine learning. So government's got to play a really significant role and find ways to support businesses in speeding up the reskilling and training activity, because otherwise you end up with a long lag of a lot of unemployment, where people become long-term unemployed, find it difficult to re-enter the labour market, and actually you end up with lots of industries being scarred. So the key way is to be interventionist, not on keeping people not doing anything, but paying them and funding them to learn new skills and new ways of working.
So just moving on, I suppose, to the remote working piece, and we've sort of been thrown into this I think I described it for as a bit of an experiment back in March. At FRS, we're very traditional type business, 70 offices across the country, all told a couple of thousand employees, and we didn't even have 1% of people working remotely. So it was a huge challenge for us, but our IT team did a phenomenal job and moved probably over 500 people into a remote working situation within 2 days, right? Now, it was sort of, edge of the seat stuff for a week or so, but then we moved into this sort of, business as usual sort of piece pretty quickly, I think. And I think what we have seen is that it's worked very, very successfully for most people. I think we've seen that we probably have we've really good technology in place, and I think it's some of the work we did with you, Kevin, probably over a couple of years, is around culture and values, and that sort of having trust in our people, which we'll probably come on to a little bit later. That was the enabler, I think. And it's worked phenomenally well, and we're starting to look at leases now and where we've got offices, like do we keep offices, and I suppose we'll talk a bit about hybrid type of approach in a little while, but in the main it's worked very, very well. I think the challenge really has been for certain types of roles, particularly we've seen within the organization. So you mentioned call center, Kevin, and I think that's where you have a young sort of team. I think young people typically, I remember when I was early 20s, you went to work, you know what I mean, for your social life as much as you did for the actual work. Obviously I've copped on to that and I've learned a lot since then, but I think that funnily enough, those sort of younger people are a little bit more disengaged, and pushed us to get them back into the offices. Particular types of roles like IT, our whole IT team has been working remotely. Our whole finance team has been working remotely. We use Microsoft Teams. It's been really, really effective. And I think the challenges really coming back from people have been around a little bit socially distant from the business, and that sort of water cooler sort of time, is that what we're seeing in general, do you think, out there with organizations? Is that the general sort of feedback you were getting, Brendan, out on the ground? Or?
Yeah, look, I mean, most organizations were thrown in at the deep end, without any of the buffers. Then it was a case of, look, just figuring out day to day, week to week. And it has been the most incredible, I suppose, disruption to the normal model of work organization that most of us are broadly familiar with. And organizations and staff have done an incredible job in responding to that challenge. And, to the extent that, look, I think one of the great things, certainly in my experience of working in Ireland and working with organizations, is that, look, in a crisis, there is no better place to be in terms of the capacity of people to respond and put their shoulder to the wheel. So, the reality is organizations had to cut through, I suppose, some of the red tape in terms of just getting it done, and with the support of colleagues. So, for example, I mean, under the normal rules and so on, there's all sorts of stuff, obviously, about risk assessment, about the remote work location that, strictly speaking, is supposed to be done. And again, to be fair to the authorities, including the Health and Safety Authority, they recognise that, and some useful guidance was made available about how workers could self-assess instead of the employer having to send somebody out to a person's home, and the time and effort and all of that. So a lot of decisions were taken at a pragmatic level to cut through. However, I think now that we've had the experience, and most organizations have had some, if not huge, experience of all of this, now is the time to assess where are we going and how should this play in to the future.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And there's a question just from Tom there. So, do you have any view on the Shopify model of having a completely remote workforce? It's interesting to access skills anywhere. So, everything's going fantastic. Let's just move everyone 100% remotely.
Well, I mean, there are businesses that can adopt that approach. Technology businesses where people have got very, great ability to do their job from home. And the question is, when I think Brendan was absolutely right, people were just forced into this. You had to respond, you had to adapt to the circumstances. So, and I think what you've now got to do, and what businesses are doing, is going, where does this work for us? Where does it add some value? What do our employees think of this? Are they enjoying it? Do they want to work this way? Fantastic poll in the UK from people that are currently working remotely. What was their ideal scenario? 78% said they want to do 80% at home and 20% in the office. Only 15% said that they wanted to do 50-50, and 7% said they want to do 80% in the office and 20% at home. So there's a skewing of people that want the flexibility, that want to spend some of their time at home. I think the challenge for organizations is managing a hybrid. When everyone's working at home, managers are quite clear. They manage through Zoom or whatever the technology is, and they talk to everybody in the same way. But it becomes much more challenging when you've got people working 1 day or 2 days in the office, when you have a meeting where half the team are in and half are at home. I think that becomes more difficult for managers and leaders than everybody working remotely or everybody being in the office.
Is that not a case of where, I suppose, managers start coming along and start, we need to have processes, and all this sort of stuff starts to slow the whole thing down, and within a year you're going, actually, this isn't going to work anymore. So you move from productivity going really well to managers and people who are implementing process and stuff like that, slowing the whole thing down again.
But the opportunity for business is huge, right? What our people have been saying in terms of what their view of their employer and work. Only 17% of people at work say they're fully engaged, right? That's Gallup data. 17%. 83% are just turning up, going through the motions. What we've seen during this crisis as engagement and trust has increased, because what we're doing is we're changing leadership and management from managing the input, watching what people do every day, to managing the output and the outcome, which is what we've been saying organizations need to do. So I think this is a great opportunity where employees are saying, actually, I'm being trusted. I'm allowed to get on with my job. Let me get on with it. And actually, organizations are seeing productivity increase because what people are doing.
Can I just, one of the rallying calls, of course, around remote work generally is to say, look, productivity increases. Now, that may well be true, and a lot of the data analysis shows that, to be fair, in terms of a sort of a direction of travel. Mind you, of course, if it is true, it says, well, what the hell's been going on back in the office then? If in terms of, if that actually is the case, right?
Yeah.
However, I suppose I think the fantastic opportunity that now exists, and I would love for Irish business to actually take a really strong lead in this space and to be internationally renowned for this, is remodeling work organization around these sorts of new concepts, right? Okay, none of us would like to have been here forced to be having these conversations because of COVID. We are here. But to my mind, one of the big challenges I think that managers have to get their head around, and organizations, is, look, this isn't something for everybody. It's not necessarily something for all businesses. It's not necessarily the Shopify model for all. Right, businesses have to really start thinking strategically about their own business model and the work organization model that will feed and support that. So one example of that, right, and I came across this by accident a little while ago, which I think is really relevant, even just to sort of start the brain cells thinking about the managerial challenges. A piece of research, I think it was done by Wharton Business School in the States, but that essentially talked about people being, broadly speaking, either they call it, segmenters or integrators. So segmenters are people who basically, they focus on work during working time or working hours, and family life is family life. They need a separate space at home. They think of it very much in blocks of time, whereas obviously integrators are much more comfortable with the flexibility of their day, blurred boundaries between work and family life, and actually those people are probably more likely to work an extended day. And it was interesting, actually, I just came across something this morning actually on Bloomberg that indicated based on some of the survey material that's been done there, that on average people have been actually extending their day by something like 48 or 50 minutes or something like that, right? And now, don't ask me how they come up with that, but whatever about the truth of it, that's obviously a challenge too. But from a managerial point of view, what that is raising then is, to my mind, is, well, look, how do we actually engage differently with people who are working remotely to deal with those sorts of issues, given the diversity of how people actually approach the world of work? And Kevin's point is actually really important, because all the rules and regulations are framed around monitor this, monitor that, assess this, assess that, record time, and so on. In a remote working environment, while of course, people have to, there has to be some basic fundamentals, but the most important issue that for a manager is saying, look, are people doing what they're supposed to be doing, and less about when they do it, and whether it's this time or that time. It should be about outputs and the productivity rather than time.
So I think I read an article from Adam Grant the other day, moving from management to macro management. Do you know what I mean? It's that sort of bigger piece, looking at the outcome. But organizations find that really difficult to do, I think,
But it's also, but go back to the fundamental. What do managers do in most organizations? They control tasks. That's what they do historically. And while we've been trying to change workflow and you know, if you go back into organizations, I've talked to HR directors over the last 20 years, and they've always said that their frontline managers aren't good enough, right? What this situation, remote working, hybrid working, has shown that there are managers that can inspire, motivate, and engage, and there is a high proportion that can't. And what organizations are going to have to do is think about the skills and capabilities of frontline managers to manage output and outcome, and not to manage task, not to manage the input. And that's a big shift. And I think what we're going to see is huge investments in the management and leadership skills of frontline managers, because they're the people that have to bring new organizational design, new organizational ways of working to life. And actually, the problem we have is they're going to be the ones that are going to want to do it in the old way. They're the ones that phone up HR on day 2 and go, can I have a list of how much time my people are spending online and what they're looking at? Because they want to control the input, rather than, as Brendan has said, articulate what the goals are, what the outcomes, what the outputs are, and you've got the time. I don't care when you do it. You can do your work in the evening, early in the mornings. Look after your kids. It doesn't matter. But by the end of 2 weeks' time, I need you to have achieved that. So that requires a fundamental shift in leadership and management behavior that organizations are only just beginning to understand, and they really need to think about it strategically. Because if they allow managers to stay in the system to try to manage people using the old paradigm, it will stifle the opportunities that they have from working in a different way and getting improved productivity, improved performance, improved engagement. So that's what I mean, is there's a huge opportunity, but organizations need to grasp this. Otherwise, what will happen is we'll end up with the worst of all worlds. People feeling lonely, not belonging. We'll have managers trying to micromanaging and people feeling very distant from the organization. So it's not just the means of working at home or working in the office. It's how it's managed. And that's the redesign that organizations are starting to think about.
And Colin, though, on that point, the other thing that we're seeing, and we've all borne witness to it. I mean, who wants to be on as we might have done in the office, sat through a 2-hour or 3-hour meeting or whatever, right? I mean, those days are gone.
Definitely if you're with Kevin, anyway. Jeez.
Those days, let's be face it, those days are gone. We're now, we've seen the incredible rise of the 30-minute meeting online, right? Once it goes beyond that, maybe an hour, obviously, for this sort of experience or whatever. But once you're outside of those parameters, that generally speaking isn't happening. And to those who will point to, for example, there's all this remote working stuff is fine, but sure, you've just said, look, on average, some of the research is pointing to an extended day. But there's also research that is showing, right, that where managers actually adapt their model and engage more regularly, I suppose, with remote work or with their own staff, where there's more one-to-one time with those individuals during the day, helping them to prioritize, helping them to understand the deliverables and when they have to do certain things and so on. The research is showing that actually is helping to reduce the time that people are wasting during the day, that's leading to that overextension. And all of that comes down to, look, there's a shared responsibility here on the part of the individual to ask their managers questions about, look, what's expected of them, to manage that relationship upline. But obviously, to my mind, the bigger challenge here is for managers to rethink their own approach about how they manage their teams and engage with teams in this new environment that we're dealing with.
I think one of the key things I think is really interesting, we talk about reskilling, right? But we definitely, we know we don't prepare people for work, through education. So how work works. And we certainly haven't even started to look at preparing people through the education system for remote work, the gig economy, contracting, etc. So that's a key thing. And I think what that sort of feeds into as well is, so it's actually the workers who could be affected the most by this, I think, in terms of progression, right? So how do you progress within an organization currently? So you get face time with the people you need to do it. So I suppose for workers to progress and organizations to help workers progress, doing it in an online environment is a real challenge. Like we see this across from our Tourist Nua business, where we engage with unemployed people. When we see FaceTime in classroom type environments, we see a rise in engagement, like really off the scale sort of stuff. So how do we progress our people within organizations without that sort of FaceTime, and if they're working remotely all the time?
Isn't it really about what you measure? So again, one of the things I think that organizations have struggled with is, what do we measure to really look at in terms of performance, you know? And I think we've had antiquated systems to do that. I think the more that you start to talk about outputs and, you know, deliverables and what people have to deliver within their roles, the more it becomes transparent. And so, you know, it isn't, you know, what, you know, if you go back to the Moneyball stuff, you know, you go back to that example of you looking at data. You know, what happens is the coaches go, I think they're great. I think they can do this. I think they can do that. But the data shows that that weird little person in the corner actually is a fantastic performer, does things that no one's really aware of. So the more that you get into data, it becomes less about observation and more about actually looking at the performance that's delivered by individuals and teams.
Yeah,
and if you look at teams, that's when you start getting to the management bit.
Yeah, I agree with you in one sense that you can identify the good performers, but how do you progress the bad performers in a remote sort of situation where you would normally, so in terms of knowledge transfer and that type of thing, it's just much more difficult to do in an online sort of setting. Yeah. Like, you know, so I think virtual classrooms, and I think Pamela from Scotland has just commented on that, and can help. But what I'm sort of getting at, is there a sort of a, as you mentioned earlier, sort of a hybrid sort of situation, a touchdown for
a quick one just before you hand over to Brent. I mean, there's loads of great tools. You know, the issue that people have got often within remote working is they're quite good at talking to their team. They're really good at talking to their manager, the people that historically they would have sat close to. The bit they lose is the interaction with the rest of the organization. So they become quite siloed. And one of the things that you're starting to see is a lot of the tools are doing, you know, whiteboard working, collaboration exercises, establishing cross-functional projects, just so that the people in marketing work with the people in sales, work with the people in finance. So I think you're going to see technology supporting people working in different ways where, you know, they have to interact with other people within the organization rather than just the people that they work with every day.
But we have to also, I suppose, acknowledge, look, there are real challenges for people, I suppose, who are remote working, and depending on your personality type and so on, it can be very difficult sometimes, you know, to get visibility with your manager to actually show that you're actually, you know, that you are busy, right? And that you're not out mowing the lawn, you know. So I had this conversation actually in an organization recently with a team of people, and I said, look, you know, do the sensible things. Don't be afraid to overshare, you know, about what you're doing. You know, have a conversation with your manager about, you know, the frequency that they expect, about, and also the means of any status updates, about how they want to be updated and when, and follow that, right? But also don't be afraid, you know, things that sharing your calendar, showing, you know, so you're pretty much logging what you're doing, etc. Maybe through your calendar, doing a weekly roundup, you know. I suppose putting yourself a little bit more out there. Now, that's challenging for some individuals outside of an office environment where there's easy visibility. But again, for the individual, they have to take a responsibility here as well to say, look, you know, if I want this to work, I have to show the organization that I'm performing just as well, if not better, in this environment. And you know, posing questions regularly on projects or issues or whatever that are coming up. Encouraging the manager to come back to you and so on. And again, my inclination would be always to sort of put the focus on the results that you're trying to achieve, which again, you know, make sure that you're still not out of sight, out of mind with your manager.
So I think I was quite shocked a couple of weeks ago. Well, you wouldn't be, Brendan, because you've lived in this space, but I think one of the unions was talking about you know, the stuff that needed to be put in place in terms of, you know, protecting workers and not working too many hours and all that sort of stuff. And I think they're really starting to push government now in terms of to step in. And, you know, I would particularly worry, like we just discussed about it. It's a challenge for leadership within organizations to, I suppose, move to this new sort of way of working in terms of remotely, etc. But as we see government intervention on the horizon, and particularly what we've seen in the last few years is that push of unions having probably a little bit more sort of say in that. Like, how should government really look at that? You know what I mean, going forward, or what's the best way of you know, protecting the worker while making sure the organization you know, can still work properly?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things going on actually at the moment in the Irish context that's really important just for people maybe online, just to remind them a little bit about. We've just actually closed a consultation process. By government launched this public consultation on guidance for remote working. And that was on the back of a fairly significant piece of research that was done back in Q4 of last year, now all admittedly pre-COVID, which was pointing obviously to, even at that point, a very significant upsurge in interest in remote working for all the reasons that we're now familiar with, and obviously that has accelerated dramatically because of the COVID experience. We've seen the Congress of Trade Unions out championing around some of the concerns that they have, for example, around the implications that are now starting to come through, including, you know, issues about extended day and all that kind of goes with that. But from an employer point of view, in the regulatory space, there are a number of issues I think that do need to be addressed. There are concerns about, for example, on the equality agenda, if you put a remote working policy in place, how do you deal with the issue, for example, of, well, it has to be offered to all and not to some, and issues of that nature. There's the whole health and safety kind of agenda in terms of repositioning the responsibilities of both the employer and the employee in that respect. Bearing in mind, of course, the reality is that, look, for the foreseeable future, the notion, for example, of shared workspaces or indeed hot desking raises all sorts of issues about hygiene and health and safety protocols and what have you. So the whole issue about risk assessment being conducted versus the challenges about individual employee privacy in their own home. These are complex issues that have to be worked through and obviously clarified by way of guidance and not to mention data protection and security, technology security issues. But what I would hope to see is that we will see that guidance come through over the next number of months for both employers and workers. Now, the difficulty is that there is currently a danger that on the other end of all of that, which would be practical, sensible advice, is that we will also see movement potentially around this idea of a right to disconnect, which has gathered a lot of momentum. There are already arrangements in place in places like Spain and France and Italy. But at least in France, for example, it's been left company level for some of the stuff to be agreed. And in Germany, indeed, the non-legal approach has been adopted and it's been a matter for social partners to deal with. But at the moment, there's a very significant push in that respect. And indeed, in the programme for government here, just in the last couple of weeks, the Irish government has committed to considering legislation in this space. But again, the danger is that the debate will very quickly move away from the reality of what employers and workers really need. Currently, our regulations actually do provide for obligations under the working time legislation about records being kept, about hours and breaks and so on and so forth. My view, however, is that once we enter the realm of regulation for the right to disconnect, above and beyond what parties might agree themselves as practical, sensible arrangements, we will start to do damage to the inherent value of remote working for both the employer and the individual. And it's interesting to see that for the first time, we're now even starting to see, albeit there's only been one, to my knowledge, of an actual collective agreement between AIB Bank here and the Financial Services Union on the issue. But we've also seen multinationals, some big brands talk about having a curfew and sending emails after hours, just as a matter of good HR practice and policy. And that's where it needs to be dealt with, not by over-regulating, which will ultimately do damage to the opportunity that this gives for workers and employees.
What do you think, Kevin?
Yeah. I sort of agree with Brendan. I mean, I think that this is a huge experiment. You know, I think that organisations will get it wrong. There'll always be bad employers. There'll always be 1-2% that try and exploit people and don't do things the right way. But what you don't want to do is government get to regulation as, you know, early without really spending time listening to business and listening to their citizens and people that are at work. Otherwise, I think you run the risk of doing exactly what Brendan said, which is ending up with some regulation which curtails the opportunity and has lots of unintended consequences for both businesses and citizens. And you want to, you know, you want our economy to thrive. We want our businesses to thrive, to grow employment, to look at living standards, and to do that, we want to embrace technology. So I think government needs to think, it needs to wait, it needs to look at the data and the evidence. I think guidance is the right way to go. And you don't regulate until you see there's real significant market failure where businesses aren't doing the right stuff. And if that becomes apparent, then government quite rightly would step in. But don't do it early. Really understand what's going on and make sure it works for all parties concerned. Issue guidance, certainly initially, and then think about legislation as, you know, the last resort.
Great. So just shifting back right to so we touched on it really, the whole leadership piece and trust piece. So how, I suppose, start with you, Kevin, really. So how do organizations actually make that work? So you get a shift in thinking, you say, right, someone says, right, we want to shift to, you know, a hybrid model or, you know, 80% remote, you know what I mean? At a high level, what would you advise them, or how do you start on that sort of journey? Really,
I think there's a couple of things that are really quite important, and I think it goes back to the heart of a lot of things that we've talked about on this, which is you have to engage the individuals. You have to talk to individual worker by individual worker and explore what will work for them. What we're looking at is mass personalization. So what will work for me might be radically different from what will work for you. Now, if the organisation wants both of us to continue to be employed and deliver what we're delivering, then if I say I want to come into the office 3 days a week because I haven't really got the right setup at home, that works for me. And you go, actually, I only want to pop in once a month to see the team.
That's really difficult, though, isn't it? That's a challenge.
But that, I think, is where you're going to find. You're going to end up with some basically rules around engagement. What the organisation says is the minimum. What we're expecting is that, you know, I don't know, in our organisation, we want everyone to have been in the office, to have participated in 2 work meetings face to face. And, you know, then people may want to work 3 days at home, 2 days in the office. Some people work for that. I think is down to manager and individual workers. And actually, you've got to trust people. That's the point. What works for them, their circumstances, as long as the business is clear about its minimum expectations, then I think it's a matter of trying to find the right solution for team and organisation and individuals. Of course, it's difficult, and I'm not saying it's easy, but I'm saying that's the journey we're on, I think. That's the only way that you can really do this fairly, transparently, and get the right outcomes for both business and individuals.
I think though as well, Colin, that one of the kind of key issues that organizations as they're going to have to start thinking about is, where does this fit? We touched on it earlier, you know, we're now seeing organizations, you know, in some cases having to take the hard decisions about fundamental restructuring and unfortunately redundancies and so on and so forth being maybe followed. But as everybody picks up the pieces from this crisis, what's the business model for the future, and what's the work organization model to support that? Now, in this space, to my mind, organizations need to start thinking about those roles which, well, first of all, around what we're doing and what's core and non-core. Once we're clear that, look, there are core functions that have to be supported, what's the resourcing model to support those? What within those roles, which roles then should be maybe designated for remote work, or let's maybe call it remote first, right, for want of a better term. There might well then be a second tranche of roles that could, where it would be intended, and this is where the honest conversation has to happen internally, that look, we don't see this role being permanently, something that is done on a remote basis, but on an interim basis, for reasons X, Y, and Z, this role would be deployed on a remote basis. And the reason for that is we also have to realize that because of the uncertainty of this crisis and the COVID pandemic in particular, we are probably going to see a 2 steps forward, 1 step back experience because of clusters. So as we've seen, for example, in the UK, in Ireland, we may see in certain locations decisions having to be taken on a regional basis or on an urban basis to impose certain restrictions. And from a work point of view, that means that organizations may have to turn on the tap or off the tap, depending on where they are and where they have offices and where they're located. So they need to think flexibly around how they actually deploy this particular model. And then, of course, beyond that, in terms of the modality of doing this, then there is the hybrid issue. Is it everybody, is the person at home? What's their connectivity to the office? Or, as we're probably going to see, you touched on it earlier, about organizations looking now about, do they need central offices and large numbers of potentially to house people? Increasingly, that's not going to be the case. And we're probably, because of all the benefits, including around commuting times and work-life balance issues and so on, the hybrid model may well go through a further manifestation whereby people aren't necessarily coming in to a central office anymore, but they may be going to regional hubs or out of town locations. And so all of that is also going to be reimagined. And I think that's probably, for me, one of the most exciting things to have a conversation about is, look, how do we reimagine these moving parts, as well as thinking about the protections that people need? But I would like to see that being worked out at enterprise level at a pragmatic way, rather than being over-regulated.
Yeah, I think for me, it's a really exciting thing. Like I suppose, obviously, we're involved in delivering government services on the employability side and that, and the challenges we see in Ireland, particularly, and it's the same in the UK, socially, around commuting 2 hours to work. Attracting talent, like organizations, like we're in Tipperary here, we're trying to attract talent to Tipperary, particularly in a specialist level, has always been a real challenge. Female participation in work in Ireland is 10 points lower than the rest of Europe. And I think for me, this offers just a massive opportunity, obviously for organizations, but societally as much.
Yeah,
you know what I mean, it's just an absolutely massive opportunity. And sorry, Kevin.
And I think one of the things that you just touched on is really interesting. Is I think the idea, hybrid doesn't just mean in the office or at home. I think we're going to see growth in hours that people work. So what we would talk as, flexibility. I want to start at 10 and finish at 3. I want to work 3 days a week. I want to work term time only. I want an annualized hours contract. This experiment is going to get people to think a lot more about what works for them, and actually start to talk to their employer about, I tell you what, I really do want to spend a bit of time doing other stuff outside of work. And if you can give me what I want, boy, am I going to be a loyal, high-performing employee. So I think the debate about flexible work will grow off the back of this as well. And I think you've got in and out, and then you've got hours of work, and all of that stuff will grow as well.
Tom says, remember not to tear up the HR manual, right? But actually, you probably have to tear up your existing HR manual and start again, because this offers, as you mentioned, when you move from, I suppose, group type processes and policies from a HR perspective or any perspective to an individualization piece, it creates obviously an awful lot more work for HR, really, doesn't it? You know what I mean? And I suppose to be more strategic in how they work. So,
but I think one of the really exciting issues, though, that this is again going to we've kind of touched on some of these things, but for me, the big challenge now for HR providing leadership to their organizations around this particular issue is, look, what is the extent of choice we are willing to afford our people? And this is back to this trust issue. Do we have enough trust in our people to make the right decision for them, but obviously in the interest of the organization as well? Have we got the management competencies to manage people in this now new diverse environment? What are the performance, can we reimagine our conversation around performance and deliverables? And then, just to be controversial about it, what the hell? What about reward? Because if we want to do this holistically, we will also have to rethink what people are paid for in this new order. And now that might well be several stages down the road, but if we're doing this, let's have that conversation.
So at a micro level, there's a really interesting debate going on, starting to emerge, right? So how much do you pay someone who's working remotely in Donegal versus working in Dublin, or working, in Yorkshire? God knows who'd want to live in Yorkshire versus London.
But Colin, isn't that great? Because actually, it doesn't matter where they live. It's the output. That's the thing. We've been paying on the wrong thing, the wrong paradigm. This gives you the opportunity to employ people wherever they want to be located to deliver the outcomes that the business needs and pay them appropriately. So I think Brendan's touched on something. HR, I'm seeing a lot of turnover in HR directors. A lot of that is because the HR directors that lots of organizations have had haven't got the ability to reinvent and help the leaders of the organization, the chief execs and the finance function, think through how do we redesign what we do, our operating model, and how we engage our people. What are our minimum standards? Throw away the blooming rule book and that set of thousands of policies. Let's have 10 principles about how we treat our people. Let's try and find managers that can embrace that and deliver it and have those mature, sensible, grown-up conversations. So I think it really means that absolutely HR has got to step into a leadership role and got to really challenge and lead organizations through this process. So I think there's a huge opportunity, but I think a lot of them are wanting at the moment and going, Christ, this is all a bit difficult. Can't we just go back to how it was 6 months ago?
If only.
Yeah, but actually, I think, and if we look at, I won't even call it worst case scenario, because I've been saying that. I think 6 months ago I was saying, sure, worst case scenario in 6 months we'll be back, but potentially, we're looking at a couple of years of this sort of stuff. You know what I mean? And I think people are starting to wake up to, actually, they moved into crisis mode, and when you're in crisis mode, it's just let's get through the next couple of months. And now people are starting to look a little bit more longer term and saying, right, this is not going away anytime soon. We're going to have to handle it in the longer term. And I think it's been really good, actually, that companies are starting, and organizations, HR people, and leaders within organizations starting to say, like, we better start planning here. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
And, so it's a huge.
This has to be seen as a huge opportunity. It really is. I mean, look, everybody has got their pain. Will have their war story from COVID, right? Whenever we write the memoirs about 2020, it'll be full of those pages. But I would love to see a chapter in the world of work written about the Irish story, about how we responded creatively and progressively and showed international leadership about how we reimagined the work organization. Yeah. And we can do that, and organizations will do.
And I think Ireland's got a great opportunity. I really do, because one of the things I would say, being an external observer, is communication, infrastructure's not that great, broadband. So this is an opportunity to put the basic infrastructure in place. You're very good at attracting high levels of technology businesses and stuff from the States. And you mentioned TikTok already. The ability to create high quality work for your population, particularly in terms of what we're doing in the UK with Brexit and the self-harm we've created for ourselves. The opportunity for Ireland is immense. But you do need that basic infrastructure and a set of ways of working, which I think could enable you, as Brendan says, to give you a huge advantage in terms of inward investment and in terms of actually creating a great work environment for your citizens and population, which will mean that, higher paid work, more disposable income, strong economy, you know, and it's that virtuous circle. But it all starts with work.
Yeah, I do think though as well, and just not to harp on about it, but a real concern, Colin, I have is that because of the political system at the moment and some of the commitments that have been made, that there is a danger that we'll regulate for the old world, not for the new world.
Oh well, I think historically Ireland has a history of doing that across many different sort of areas. But I think, look, in fairness, in terms of there was a lot of fear around the sort of Kevin, we have I suppose a tripartite government now of Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil, but the Green Party, right? So, but the Green Party are really pushing areas, and I think it's for me it's an area that the Green Party should be jumping on, is remote work, because it actually plays straight into their agenda. Less commute, less cars, less cities, moving people out, you know what I mean? But they get sort of tied up in in their old agendas. But I think we're starting to see that move a little bit. Any final thoughts, Brendan?
My one is, look, let's just go for it. Let's stop faffing around, worrying about the downside. Like there are downside risks with everything you do in life, but the upside on this for workers, for businesses, for the economy, for government, even politically, as you just mentioned, are all huge. Yes, there are issues that have to be thought through at a pragmatic level. But for me, and I know the focus is around, obviously today, around remote work, but that has to start with businesses reimagining their own business model for the new normal that lies ahead. But the critical actor in this is going to be the HR leadership that the organization has internally or has access to, that actually brings some really innovative and blue sky thinking to this space to make this happen and adds value to the business model. And we can do that in Ireland.
Yeah, I think it's really key. HR for years are talking about, we're not at the big top table. Well, this is just an immense opportunity, isn't it? It's like it just landed in a plate there. Right, go and fix this and make sure we make the most of it. So, Kevin, what's your final thoughts?
I suppose my last one. I mean, let's just talk to. We've done sort of macro stuff. Let's just talk at an enterprise level. I think there's a couple of things that HR and leaders need to do. One is be creative, try stuff out, pilot things. And while you're doing that, involve your people. What you've got to do is you've got to run lots of mini experiments to find out what works for them and works for the organization. You've got to have a macro view of your operating model and how you're going to deliver services to customers. But within that, try stuff. I think the idea that everything needs to be designed in the center by the top team is just nonsense. What you've got to do is try an agile approach, engage people in this, try stuff out, try some experiments, and out of that will become the right model for you and the right model for your people. And as long as it fits your operating model, I think you end up with a win for the workforce. A more engaged workforce, performing and productivity higher than it was before. You end up with less cost because of less travel, blah, blah, blah. You end up with the business performing that much better. And then you end up with the economy benefiting. So I think it's a huge opportunity for businesses to do, as Brendan said, reimagine, reinvent, recreate, reset. I don't mind what it is, but just make sure you get the benefits and you take the opportunity.
I think that's really fantastic. I think I suppose just listening to you both, it's actually, I think it's probably the experiment and this thing has landed us into just a really exciting sort of time. Obviously, we know, we have a huge amount of negatives going on at the moment around the place, and we're all fighting with that. But this is sort of the one, or one of the sort of clearance there in the clouds going forward that we can sort of look towards and work towards. And I know organizations really have huge challenges in the day-to-day stuff, but if they can get their heads up and just to summarize really in terms of what you talked about earlier, that shift in leadership thinking. Do you know what I mean? People leadership thinking really is just vital, and reimagining, I suppose, how we operate those different models. engaging the individuals and just really piloting sort of systems. You know, I think it probably would be a mistake from a traditional type organization to try and just shift to this overnight. Yeah. You know what I mean? It's just very, you know, you need to look at it, test things out, you know, mass personalization. And, you know, the basic starting point is get the rules of engagement right, as you were saying, Kevin. Get those basics right, and then you can sort of build on that and measure on output rather than tasks and what people are doing. In terms of the poll, basically, I think between 30 to 50% moving to remote work. Over 60% of people think that, and over 50% is 36%. So, and I think since the last time we did that, we, you know, that's increasing all the time. You know, I think people are starting to, like, back when we did a remote working webinar, what was it, Kevin, around about 2 months ago, even 10 weeks ago, it was much lower. We're starting to see people say, yeah, this is going to work. Obviously, there's challenges, but I suppose we just need to get on with doing that, you know. So I think that was really fantastic. We're bang on the hour, more or less. So Kevin or Brendan won't be getting paid overtime for this webinar anyway. But
Hangman. Did you hear that, Brendan?
Now he tells us.
I'm off for some cucumber sandwiches and watch some more cricket in the afternoon, and maybe some Pims. You know, so look, really fantastic to have you both on board, Kevin, as always. Brendan, thanks a million, and thanks to everyone for getting involved. Thanks a lot. Bye bye.
Cheers, guys. Cheers, Colin. Cheers, FRS.
Bye.